You're listening to The Pivot, brought to you by Globally News, where we discuss the leaders, states, networks, ideologies and technologies that are reshaping the world order. Visit our website at globally.news. That's globe, L-Y, .news.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Pivot. My name is Arif Rafiq, and I'm your host. In the Middle East, multiple theaters of conflict, one organization looms large: Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC, as the group is known, was born in the cauldron that followed Iran's 1979 revolution. As Ayatollah Khomeini sought to impose hegemony over a diverse movement that overthrew the Shah, the new Islamic Republic found itself at war after it was invaded by Iraq in 1980. For the IRGC and for Qasem Soleimani, the longtime and now slain leader of its external operations wing, the Quds Force, this was a baptism by fire. Loyal to Iran's supreme leader, the IRGC is tasked with guarding Khomeini's revolution from within and extending the Islamic Republic's strategic depth beyond Iran's territorial limits. Today, the IRGC is involved in conflicts in Gaza, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere, and it also plays an ever-growing role at home. The IRGC is now not only one of the two most powerful institutions in Iran, it's also among the most powerful in the Middle East. And in this episode, we're going to take a deep look at the IRGC's path to power and how it leveraged U.S. missteps to transform from being a ragtag militia to a preeminent outside force in Iraq, Syria, and other conflict-hit zones. We'll explore the IRGC's network of partners, including the so-called Axis of Resistance, and we'll evaluate the strengths and weaknesses in how the IRGC leverages these groups as part of its strategy of asymmetric warfare. Our guide in this journey is Afshon Ostovar, an associate professor of national security at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Dr. Ostovar is the author of The Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards. In August, he'll have a new book out, Wars of Ambition, the United States, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. It's available for pre-order now and very much looks like a must-read. We'll have links to both books on our website, and to get there, click on the link in the show notes. And just to note, we spoke to Afshon last week before Sunday's deadly attack on U.S. forces in Jordan, which President Biden attributed to an Iran-backed militia. Those attacks and those accusations made by the Biden administration make the forthcoming conversation even more important. And now to our show. Afshon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to begin by talking about the IRGC's formative period. It's born in the chaos of Iran's post-revolution moment. Ayatollah Khomeini aims to establish hegemony over a diverse movement that overthrew the Shah and impose a very distinct type of order. And then amid this upheaval, Iraq invades Iran. So I'd like you to explain the importance of this context in which the IRGC emerges and why that matters in terms of understanding its worldview and the role it plays in the Iranian regime today.
Well, as you said, the IRGC sort of begins as this ragtag militia. It was actually an umbrella organization for several militias that were all in one way or another loyal to Khomeini during the revolution and in the immediate aftermath. The Khomeinists created the IRGC as this umbrella organization that would bring together all of these various disparate militias, bring them under one leadership structure, and essentially provide Khomeini this armed force that could compete with both the remnants of the Shah's regime, but also sort of help Khomeini establish a new order. But when the Iran-Iraq war began on September 22nd, 1980, the IRGC was a military in name only. It was poorly resourced, poorly trained. Most of the volunteers were new and young. Some of them, the more veterans had been sort of what today we would call terrorists. What we called then were revolutionaries that spent time in PLO camps in Lebanon and Syria and places like that. So when the Iraq war happened, Iran is invaded, and its immediate sort of effort is to sort of expel the Iraqis. First to stop them from getting any further and then to expel them. And the IRGC, because of the lack of trust that the regime had with the regular military, the Artesh, which had still very strong associations with the Shah. The clerical leaders around Khomeini encouraged him to empower the IRGC to fight the Iraqis. And the IRGC ended up taking the lead in the war and, was compared to the Artesh, very reckless. But they were reckless in a way that proved really decisive in the war. They started using this tactic of mass infantry assaults, which we also call human wave attacks, which were really kind of how it sounds. They would just throw thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people, at the Iraqi front lines with the attempt of just overwhelming them with sheer numbers. They would exhaust ammunition, and then the Iraqis would have to retreat because they would either have to stay there and fight hand-to-hand with whoever was left, or they would have to retreat. And that's essentially how the IRGC was able to drive out the Iraqis within about a year and a half of counteroffensives that end up by the spring or by the summer of 1980, end up essentially expelling the Iraqis. And then the Iran-Iraq war shifts into a different type of conflict, one in which Iran became the aggressor, trying to push into Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. So during that second portion of the war, Iran lost any, let's say, lingering goodwill or sympathy for it. It didn't have much to begin with because neighboring countries around Iran all feared that if Iran succeeded in overthrowing Saddam Hussein, they would establish an Islamic Republic in Iraq. And that would just be the beginning of the Islamic Republic's or the Islamic Revolution's march across the Middle East, where you would have radical Shia Islamist politics facilitating the overthrow of monarchies in other authoritarian states. And so all of Iran's neighbors, and frankly, most of the world, supported Saddam Hussein in one way or another. But Iran's neighbors, particularly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, really supported Saddam Hussein by bankrolling his war. So fast forward to the end of the war, Iran is basically exhausted, gets weaker and weaker, is depleted, has little access to weapons, doesn't have the money to buy them. It strained its relationship with the Soviet Union. It had no relationship with the United States. It's more complicated than this. But basically, by the end of the war, Iran has no friends, no money, and no way to get more weapons. And Saddam Hussein is actually stronger than he was when he began the war. And ultimately Iran sort of settles for a ceasefire where it failed to achieve anything that it really wanted to achieve through 6 years of war, and almost 1 million Iranians die in the conflict. And the IRGC, who fought that war, who led that war, whose leadership and command staff all that was their formative period, they all blamed essentially the world, their neighbors, the United States, but also the world more broadly, for being against it, right? It was them against the world. And they felt that injustice of being surrounded by hostile states, of everybody supporting Saddam Hussein against them, even though they survived the conflict, they couldn't win the conflict. That's something that they never forgot. And so after the war, they invested heavily to make sure that they would never be reliant on outside powers or neighbors in order for them to maintain their own security or for them to exert power within the region.
So that us against the world mentality prevails. You say it's something they never forgot. And the IRGC is also, in terms of how it fits into the Iranian hierarchy, it's an apparatus that's loyal to the supreme leader, and it's tasked with guarding the Islamic Revolution, not simply the Iranian state, and also spreading that revolution from without, right?
Yeah, so that's sort of the curious difference between the IRGC and the regular military. People might not know this, but Iran has two militaries. It has the Artash, which I call the regular military, the conventional military, and then it has the IRGC. The regular military's responsibility is Iran's territorial integrity. They are essentially a defensive military. But the IRGC's writ is to safeguard the Islamic Revolution. That includes Iran's territorial integrity, but also includes anything you could imagine: politics, culture, economics, society, social issues, foreign policy, everything that you can imagine that belongs within a state, within a nation, within a society is what the Islamic Revolution is thought to sort of embody. And so that allowed the IRGC to have inroads from the very beginning into all aspects of Iranian life, Iranian officialdom, and Iranian policy, both domestic and foreign.
Right. And the IRGC's legitimacy comes from its ties to the supreme leader, right? Because, today we see some chatter about the IRGC maybe taking over the state, and we've seen, some may argue, an IRGCization of the Iranian state in terms of vetted presidential candidates, people who serve as governors, and as well as cabinet ministers in government since the period of Ahmadinejad. But I think you may not agree with that, right? There's a lot of folks who push back against that claim because of the specific nature of the relationship between the IRGC and the supreme leader.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, sometimes you can have a distinction without a difference when we have this conversation. A lot of sort of, IRGC specialists, the few that are out there, who really sort of make it their business to know the IRGC, kind of argue about this point, whether the IRGC has intentions to sort of control Iran like a junta, or whether it is subservient to the supreme leader. I don't think that black and white distinction really serves what's going on very well. I mean, symbolically, the supreme leader is integral to the IRGC. You cannot have the IRGC without the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the Islamic Revolution. It is the supreme leader's office, his authority is the manifestation of the Islamic Revolution. That is the Islamic system or nizam that the IRGC are sworn to protect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the supreme leader needs to be the boss all the time. He just needs to be a symbolic figurehead. So the supreme leader as an office is something that the IRGC will always fight to maintain because it's essential to the IRGC's own legitimacy. But you could imagine scenarios in the future with new supreme leaders. Ali Khamenei at some point will not be supreme leader, in which case the IRGC could take advantage of a new supreme leader. And while Ali Khamenei is very powerful and sets the parameters for Iranian policy, and the IRGC has to work within those, a future supreme leader might not be as powerful. He will be still symbolically important, but might not have the authority that Khamenei has. So when we talk about the IRGC sort of taking control or more power within the Islamic Republic, it's something that is bound to happen. The Islamic Republic is already essentially two pillars of power. It is the Supreme Leader's office, and it's the IRGC. The IRGC is synonymous with the state in Iran. It is synonymous with the Islamic Republic. It is synonymous with the Iranian government. You can't separate the two. And the IRGC, frankly, has the mechanisms to exert that power in Iran's system more than anybody else, right? It has the coercive power. It has institutional power. So in a future context, if things all remain the same, if current trend lines continue, the IRGC will continue to be sort of the center of power in the Islamic Republic. And the supreme leader will probably lose influence in terms of actual, no joke, influence on policy. But the supreme leader will still maintain a lot of importance within the architecture of the Islamic Republic.
Mm. And so the IRGC has come a long way from its ragtag origins. In your book, you write that the group is multifaceted, and after a process of formalization in the 1990s, it now operates, a massive surveillance and counterintelligence apparatus. It's besieged domestic militias, repress protesters. It's at the helm of a massive economic empire. According to some accounts, it's worth upwards of $100 billion, maybe around 30% of Iran's GDP. But as you note, it's foremost a military organization. And so getting to its military apparatus, the most famous arm is the Quds Force, which is its external arm. And correct me if I'm wrong, it was established in 1988, but has its roots in a predecessor formed in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And so it's in 1982 that the IRGC sent its first expeditionary force to Lebanon to aid the newly established group Hezbollah in combating the Israeli invasion. So I'd like you to talk to us about the genesis of this relationship, because this relationship between the IRGC and Hezbollah is probably the most important among Iran's proxies, right?
Hezbollah is certainly the most intertwined into the IRGC of Iran's other clients and proxies. I would argue that the Houthis in Yemen are the most geopolitically important at the moment. But Hezbollah is really an adjunct of the IRGC. It's in some ways calling it even a proxy is not really doing service to the relationship anymore, because the IRGC and Hezbollah work in tandem all over the world. They work in tandem in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in parts of Africa, in Latin America. They work in concert. IRGC or Hezbollah operatives work within IRGC ranks all over the place, including within Iran. So they are intimate allies, if you will, if not part of the same sort of ultimate organization. But the relationship is a deep one. It does go back to the formation of Hezbollah. The IRGC was involved in the formation of Hezbollah. The IRGC was involved in the very beginning in training Hezbollah militants in weapons and tradecraft. That relationship, was maintained from the early 80s all the way through the 90s. And then, once you get to the Arab Spring and the expansion of the IRGC's sort of influence in Syria, Hezbollah is brought in to Syria as, essentially part of the IRGC's overall military support to Bashar al-Assad. So on the one hand, Hezbollah works in lockstep with the IRGC in whatever the IRGC wants to do, wherever it does it. But the other really important part of Hezbollah, it is the main tool that Iran and through the IRGC is able to use against Israel. They've empowered Hezbollah to the degree of supplying sophisticated rockets, missiles, anti-ship missiles, drones, surveillance technology, everything you can imagine. The IRGC has provided Hezbollah in order to make them, is an impossible enemy for Israel to defeat, and an enemy in which has the ability to hold Israel hostage in the sense that it can always use its weapons against Israel should Israel ever sort of cross a certain line or try to sort of exert too much pressure on Hezbollah within Lebanon. And so that allows, the IRGC a beachhead, if you will, against Israel. And it is, in many respects, that the primary purpose of the relationship between the IRGC and Hezbollah is to strengthen them against Israel.
And so in terms of this network that the IRGC operates, is Hezbollah sort of the archetype that it seeks to replicate elsewhere? And we'll get into those specific examples later on in the show. But is Hezbollah the archetype, or is this an organization that is unique on its own and it will remain at that status and there will be no other alternative within the network as this kind of auxiliary of Iran?
It's kind of both, frankly. Were the IRGC able to establish similar organizations like Hezbollah and have the same sort of loyalty and integration that they're able to have with Hezbollah, they would do it. But the problem with all of Iran's relationships, to include Hezbollah, is that they are both clients of the IRGC, and they can be proxies of the IRGC when it comes to conflict or war or things like that. But they are also, unique individual organizations that are completely shaped by their immediate context. And the immediate context of Hezbollah is, of course, Lebanon and Lebanese politics, Lebanese society. And that runs through Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is a very unique organization because Lebanon is a very unique country, and the Shia community from which Hezbollah resides, or within which Hezbollah resides in Lebanon, has a very sort of unique status in Lebanon, and that's very different from the Shia communities in Iraq or Bahrain or South Asia or anywhere else. So all of Iran's other clients, whether you're talking about the Iraqi groups or the Houthis or the Syrian groups or whatever, are all similarly shaped by their immediate context, by their societies. And so one of the things that the IRGC has been very successful at is One, they work with groups that nobody else wants to work with. So I kind of think of Hezbollah and groups like that as political orphans. There's no other state that is looking to establish relationships with Hezbollah, at least outside of, let's say Russia. And no regional competitor is looking to Hezbollah as a potential partner. Same with the militias in Iraq. Same with the Houthis. Same with the militias in Syria. And so that gives Iran an advantage because they're willing to work with these people that nobody else is willing to work with. But Iran is in a similar boat. Iran doesn't have many friends or allies. And so these groups are also the few groups that are willing to work with Iran. Because when you work with Iran, you take on all of Iran's baggage, right? You're immediately on the radar of the United States and Europe, for potential terrorism designations and things like that. So it's not a small thing to partner with Iran. But that relationship, means that it's mutually beneficial. They both need each other because they don't really have alternatives. So that's one sort of aspect that really strengthens the relationship. But the other thing that Iran is successful at, the IRGC is successful at, is they don't really care about what these groups do domestically. They can do kind of whatever they want. They can have their own external funding schemes. Hezbollah is really involved in the drugs trade, for example, and diamonds and all sorts of things. Whatever they need to do to pay the bills beyond what Iran can afford to give them is fine, is permissible. However they want to run their internal politics is fine. However they want to run their organizations is fine. Iran doesn't care. What Iran cares about is these groups will be on Iran's side and walk in lockstep with Iran when it comes to the larger strategic policy that Iran cares about. And that's the policy primarily regarding the United States, regarding Israel, and sometimes regarding other regional competitors like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Turkey or things like that.
So those relationships, as you say, are not only mutually beneficial, but they also fit into that worldview of us against the world. So what's interesting about the 1980s is that we have this kind of combination of, very defensive operations by Iran and the IRGC aimed at, securing the country's territorial integrity and consolidating control within. And then also, it's combined with these offensive expeditionary forces that are operating in disparate parts of the world, mainly in sort of the near periphery of Iran. And that seems to me to say a lot about the strategic culture of the IRGC. Now, in the 1990s, the IRGC is reportedly involved in external operations like the bombing of a Jewish community center in Argentina. But I want to fast forward to the post-9/11 era because this is when we see the region's strategic geography really change. And so by 9/11, the IRGC has already had a role in Afghanistan, going back to the 1980s. In the 1990s, it supported anti-Taliban forces, the Northern Alliance, and there's a lot of bad blood between Iran and the Taliban at that point. And in fact, Qasem Soleimani and the IRGC actually reportedly helped the U.S. a bit in overthrowing the Taliban. But that, some say changed with the axis of evil speech. And I'd like you to talk to us about that, what that says, that moment of cooperation at a tactical level between the U.S. and the IRGC, and that shift after the axis of evil. What does that say about the IRGC as a strategic actor and this relationship between ideology as a motivation and realpolitik?
Well, I think on the one hand, you have to, step back and appreciate that the IRGC has always been, and the Islamic Republic, sometimes when I say IRGC, it's synonymous with the Islamic. And in this sense, it is. The IRGC, like the Islamic Republic, from the outset, has been very ambitious. They have wanted to overturn the Western-centered status quo of the global order from the get-go. That's something that they wanted to do at the outset of the revolution and intended to do by exporting the revolution to the near and abroad. And it's something that they have at every step attempted to do. They have not had the power to do it on their own. They can't be like the Soviet Union or China and really sort of stand up to the United States as a peer. But what they do is they try to insert themselves in in conflict zones or in crisis areas, in which case they can find themselves on the side of certain actors that are moving in the same direction as they are, or that they could sort of help, embolden to move against the West, its allies, etc. But by the 1990s, Iran had put in a ton of effort in this regard, and most of it had failed. They had tried to develop a cadre of clients and proxies in Afghanistan, and by 92, that had mostly evaporated. It had tried, to strengthen Hezbollah as something that could, really challenge Israel, but Hezbollah was mired in fighting against the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and the Syrian occupation of Lebanon is ongoing at the same time. And both of those things sort of really constrain what Hezbollah is able to do. It's powerful in a way, but it's not all that significant, and it's certainly contained. Iran had Iraqi allies that it had that lived in Iran that it had hoped would replace Saddam Hussein if they had won that war. But of course, they didn't win that war, and so they had this Iraqi cadre that was just sort of spinning its wheels in Iran during the 90s. And so during the 90s, Iran is a little more introspective. Its economy is in ruins, and it is mostly focused on the inside. There's a big fight between the reformists and the hardliners, between these two sort of sides of the officialdom within the Islamic Republic. And the IRGC was very supportive of the hardliners, and they ultimately kind of win out. So you have this sort of domestic squabble that's happening. Still, they try to get involved in things. They get involved in the Balkans War in support of the Bosnian Muslim Army, and were really significant in funneling weapons and advisors in support of the Bosnians during that conflict. But were ultimately sidelined by the Dayton Accords. So when 9/11 happens, Iran is mostly a spent force. The Islamic Republic is mostly a spent force. It has tried to do things. It does terrorism abroad. It's able to make some noise, but it's entirely marginalized in the region. It's mostly alienated internationally. It doesn't have strong relationships with any major power, although it's by that time sort of starting to repair its relationships with China and Russia. And it's also flirting with repairing its relationship with the United States. And so there's this pragmatic streak that's there. And when the invasion of Afghanistan happened, as you mentioned, the IRGC sort of flirts the idea of supporting the effort and does a little bit to support it, but was mostly rebuffed by the Bush administration, who, I think for good reason didn't trust the IRGC's intentions, but also didn't explore where those intentions might lead in terms of diplomacy with Iran. The Bush administration really was not interested in diplomacy with Iran after 9/11, and frankly wasn't really thinking of Iran all that much because it was its primary focus was Iraq. But when the Iraq invasion happens in 2003, this really solidifies for the IRGC and for the supreme leader in Iran that the United States is doing some stuff that is not going to benefit the Islamic Republic. They've invaded Afghanistan, they've invaded Iraq. Iran has a choice to make: either completely sort of give in to what the Bush administration wants, which frankly would have been just please stop doing terrorism and be nicer to Israel, but doing those things would have gone against sort of the sacred totems of the Islamic Republic's own sort of beliefs and ideology. The other option was to try to subvert what the U.S. was trying to do in the Middle East.
Right. And so so at this moment we see the U.S. overthrows a regime that had been an adversary of Iran, right? But at the same time, Iran sees itself as surrounded by U.S. forces on two sides. And so I'd like you to unpack how Iran and the IRGC assess their predicament at this moment and how they turn that into an opportunity. And we see a maturation of its use of asymmetric warfare in this period, right?
Yeah. So, the irony, if you will, of of the Bush administration's sort of two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was that it removed Iran's two primary regional enemies. The Taliban was maybe less constraining for Iran, but they were no friend of Iran. In fact, Iran almost went to war with them in 1998. But Saddam Hussein was a real buffer to Iran's, sort of desire to sort of expand its interests and influence in the Middle East. And so when they got rid of Saddam Hussein, this was on the one hand, a real blessing to Iran. They appreciated it. And they were intent on capitalizing on it right away. They were a little less sort of invested in Afghanistan. They were interested in shaping Afghanistan from the get-go and did things to do that. But Iraq was much more important to them because Saddam Hussein was a much bigger enemy. And so his removal was a real opportunity for them. So their initial interest in Iraq was ensuring that the Baathists would never come back into power, was getting revenge against the Baathists who had been in power through assassination campaigns. And then 3, making sure that their guys, their friends, did get in power in Iraq. And remember, Iran has, these clients like the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, or SCIRI, run by the Hakim family. And then the military wing of the Supreme Council, which was known as the Badr Corps, which becomes the Badr Organization. And both of these groups quickly return back to Iraq, and both of them are accepted, as part of the returning exiles that are given sort of and encouraged to have sort of political influence in the new Iraq by the Bush administration. So on the one hand, Iran has clients that are working with the Bush administration and end up taking part in the elections and in the governments that followed. But they also are invested in this sort of ground game, if you will, this covert or clandestine effort to get revenge, to get the Baathists and make sure that they don't come back to power. And that clandestine effort very quickly moves into an effort to combat the coalition forces' occupation of Iraq. By 2004, you already have this effort by Iran to develop a new cadre of proxies. They start finding new Iraqi militants and criminals to work with, giving them money, giving them training. And their primary intent is to encourage these groups to attack the Americans and their coalition partners in order to subvert the coalition's sort of intention and operations within Iraq. And the idea was just to spoil whatever the United States had intended for Iraq, because Iran didn't trust the intentions of the United States there. So they were more intent on causing the conflict to grow, making the war in Iraq more unwinnable by each year in order to discourage any sort of desire of the United States to have a lasting military footprint in Iraq.
Yeah, and U.S. officials claim that the Quds Force provided Iraqi insurgents with explosives known as EFPs that could penetrate armor, which they say were responsible for around 20% of U.S. combat deaths in Iraq. So this is a pretty well-calibrated political game, and then what you call the ground game. And so the U.S. eventually exits Iraq, and then in 2011 and 2012, the Syrian civil war emerges. And it's in this period that the axis of resistance takes form, and we see a real maturation of this asymmetric warfare campaign or strategy by the IRGC, and its relationship with Hezbollah is taken to new heights. And so in 2011, the Arab Spring hits Syria. Syria is a Sunni majority country ruled by a clique from the Alawi community. The Alawis are a heterodox offshoot of Shia Islam. Then the anti-government protests are crushed by the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and an insurgency grows. And by 2012, things look pretty grim for al-Assad. And Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force at the time, essentially takes over the counterinsurgency. And I think what's interesting here is that now we find Iran and the U.S. on opposite ends of this battle as well, because the U.S. provided like around $1 billion in aid to Syrian rebels through Operation Timber Sycamore. So then, fast forward to today, al-Assad has prevailed. And so I'd like you to talk about this role that the IRGC and Hezbollah played there in Syria as a symbiotic forces and what that says about the IRGC's strategic resolve.
Yeah, so Syria is really important to the IRGC for a variety of reasons. There's sentimental reasons. The Assad regime supported Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. They were the only state in the region to support Iran. There was some sort of fraternal goodwill that Iran wanted to help preserve the Assad regime from being overthrown. But more importantly, Syria was a staging ground for Iran's assistance to Hezbollah. A lot of the weapons that Iran funneled to Hezbollah were either bought by Syria from Russian or Eastern European stockpiles. The rockets were produced in Syria for Hezbollah. These were things that Iran funded primarily or oversaw, but they sort of took place within Syria. Of course, because it has a land border with Lebanon, transferring these weapons was relatively easy. So when the Arab Spring hits Syria, and when the rebellion, starts to gain steam, Iran is really terrified that it's going to lose this really important piece of its overall sort of strategic matrix within the Middle East, which by that time had been growing because they had outlasted the United States in Iraq, and Iraq was now, essentially a piece of Iran's, archipelago of resistance within the Middle East, and they didn't want to lose Syria. So at the outset of protests, the IRGC was involved in helping the Assad regime. And then by the time the rebellion sort of gained steam, the IRGC becomes more and more involved, sending advisors, sending weapons. Ultimately, they bring in Hezbollah from Lebanon, and they bring Iraqi militias. The same Iraqi militias that fought the United States are now develop wings that go and help fight the rebellion in Syria. They end up creating international wing of the IRGC for foreign nationals, kind of like a foreign legion, if you will. That was manned mostly by Hazaras and Tajiks from Afghanistan and Shia Pakistanis. The Pakistanis were mostly Pakistanis that lived in Iran, but they were ultimately from Pakistan. And so Iran creates this very large sort of support network for the Assad regime, and its own sort of flag officers lead much of the offensives and the assaults against the rebellion. But the rebellion ultimately, at one point, it looks like it's going to sort of turn the corner. It's getting a lot of support from Arab states. Private donors are sending lots of money to individual militias, which ends up ultimately sort of building up the jihadist side of the rebellion, particularly Al-Qaeda and Nusra, groups like Ahrar al-Sham, and then also ISIS. And those groups were pretty effective. And so the IRGC ultimately needs to be bailed out and turns to Russia. One story has that Qasem Soleimani traveled to Moscow and met with Putin himself and encouraged Putin to intervene in Syria. And whether that was the deciding factor or not, soon after, that's exactly what Russia did. If Russia had not intervened, it's likely that the war would have gone differently in Syria. But Russian air power really made the difference in that war, and they ultimately were able to overcome much of the rebellion. So, one thing that you can see from this, one thing you can draw from this is that Iran is and the IRGC are very deeply committed to what they see as their interests within the Middle East. And they will sacrifice a lot, both sort of the status of Iran, they'll suffer sanctions, they will, trade off the money that they could use to develop Iran internally and use it to fund militias. They will do all this because what they strive to do more than anything else is transform the Middle East from a pro-U.S. sort of geography into an anti-U.S., anti-Israel geography. And they're very serious about this and will commit lots of resources to this and feel that given their successes thus far, that they are headed ultimately toward victory. They, from their perspective, defeated the United States in Iraq. They drove the United States out of Iraq. They defeated the rebellion, and defeating the rebellion wasn't just defeating the Syrians who were fighting against Bashar Assad. It was defeating the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Jordanians and the Americans and the Turks and the British and everybody else who supported the rebellion. It was, again, sort of that theme of us against the world. So, yeah, I think Syria was a testing ground, not only for sort of the seriousness of their commitment to their cause, but it was also a place where they learned a lot about how to fight a war.
Yeah. And that learning was reapplied in Iraq, where, in 2014, the Syrian civil war spread and ISIS forces took over large swaths of the country. The Iraqi army fled the ISIS invaders, and Iran offered immediate support. And these popular mobilization forces, also known as the Al-Hashd al-Shabi, or the English acronym is PMFs, many of them were aligned directly, loyal to Iran's supreme leader. So the IRGC, while being very busy in Syria, reallocates forces to Iraq, and it replicates the Syria model there. But it seems to me that the after effects of the formation of these PMFs may be even more profound than, the changes that we saw in the political equation in Iraq after the fall of Saddam. And so, the way the PMFs have transformed the political structure in Iraq, and even now we're seeing with the economy, it seems to be that, and some say that we're seeing the replication of the IRGC model in Iraq, where we have these militias that are loyal to Iran's supreme leader, that are deeply embedded in the political process through elections, and then also have captured a growing percentage of the country's economy. So it seems to me that is a significant development. I'm not sure if you agree. And then the other significant after effect of Iran's intervention after the ISIS invasion of Iraq is that now there's also a land bridge that connects Iran to the Mediterranean via Iraq and Syria. Would you agree with that those two are pretty big sort of externalities of all this?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem with Iran's strategy is that it relies almost entirely on developing, strengthening, and relying on militant groups, right? These aren't militaries. They have military capabilities, but they are not militaries in the sense they don't have the organizational structure or culture of a military. They don't have nationalist agendas, right? They have transnationalist agendas. They have transnationalist loyalties. And generally speaking, they are also overlaid with criminal networks that are extractive in nature. So if you take the Shia militias in Iraq, for example, while they are part of officialdom, while they are part of the government, while they are part of, sanctioned state forces, that's to say, official state forces, they are also heavily, involved in black market schemes, shakedown schemes. They're constantly involved in the types of money-making sort of efforts that you would associate with the mafia, for example. And this alienates them from the populace, just the same way that the IRGC is alienated from regular Iranians. The Shia militias in Iraq, the PMF, Hashd al-Shabi are also alienated from regular Iraqis. And once you sort of create this beast of a militant organization with military power that is not sufficiently funded by the state and has to find funding some other way, in that some other way, always leads it into sort of interfering in state contracts or intervening into criminal activities. It sets up these these countries for a really sort of bleak future, because their leaders, whether they're military leaders or political leaders, have really no interest in getting the country off the ground. And Iran has no interest in seeing Iraq become this powerful, independent, wonderful country. Because if that happens, Iraq ceases to need Iran. Iran needs these groups to need it. And so it benefits Iran for Iraq as a state to be weak, for Syria as a state to be weak, for Lebanon as a state to be weak, and for Yemen as a state to be weak. Because the weaker those states are, the more reliant these groups are on the largesse that they get from Iran, and the more willing they're going to be to follow Iran's policies in the region. And so that creates this sort of countervailing force against Iran's ambition. On the one hand, they want to transform the region into this sort of very powerful antithesis to U.S. Global dominion. But on the other hand, they're kind of sowing the seeds for the weakness and enduring weakness of these countries.
Yeah, so we see the state capture of these economically predatory, religiously inspired militant outfits, and they, really prevent countries like Iraq from evolving into normal sovereign states. And of course, predatory nature of politics in Iraq is not simply a byproduct of Iran's intervention. It's very much part of the political economy of the country as a whole after the fall of Saddam. But Iran clearly has no interest in putting these countries on a path toward being viable, normal states in which the state-society relationship is one that is healthy. So, when we look at the bigger picture, what we have is a post-Arab Spring moment in the Arab Middle East where Iran, a non-Arab actor, emerges as what one may say is a predominant force, and it leverages the instability and the tumult in the Arab world. And one other area in which has been hit by crisis is Yemen. And we see the Houthi forces today attacking naval vessels in the Red Sea, are at a critical global logistics choke point. And this is a group that took over the Yemeni capital of Sana'a in 2014 as part of a civil war. And Saudi Arabia the next year began a brutal bombing campaign. Now, fast forward to this year, the Houthis are in control of most of the Yemeni population. They control about a third of the country's territory, but most of where the population is concentrated. And Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to normalize ties with one another earlier this year after supporting opposing sides in Yemen and many other parts of the region. And it was part of a deal that was brokered by the Iraqis and the Chinese. So we have another arena in which the IRGC and the Iranian regime and state come out on top. But I'm wondering, when we look at the behavior of the Houthis, to what extent is there an Iranian hand here? Because there's a lot of conflicting accounts with this respect. We have some indication that Iran is providing essential arms, including missiles and drones, as well as fuel and even some types of training. But can the Houthis be regarded as a kind of a proxy of Iran in the sense that, let's say, Hezbollah is, or do they have quite a bit of agency in terms of the relationship?
Well, all of these groups have agency in their relationships, but the way that agency is exercised is different for each group. The Houthis are clearly very different than Hezbollah. I mean, one, their relationship with the Islamic Republic is much younger. They come from a different branch of Shia Islam, which has a different sense of how religious authority is supposed to work. And so the supreme leader of Iran, as the supreme religious authority for the Houthis, kind of works politically, but it doesn't ultimately work religiously for them. And so over time, it's not as neat of a fit. Yemen is obviously much more complicated. The Houthis control much more territory. The Houthis, even though they're a group and we call them things like rebels, or we call them, a militia, I mean, they're also kind of a state. I mean, they control most of the infrastructure within Yemen, airports, ports. They have ballistic missiles. They have tanks. They have things that states and militaries have and use them like states and militaries would. So they also are they have the capacity to be much stronger than Iran's other groups because they're not just groups, right? Or it's not just a group. So the question really becomes, how much of the Houthis' policies does Iran, let's say, dictate or shape or heavily influence? When it comes to domestic stuff, very little is shaped by Iran. Iran doesn't care. I mean, you can look at some things like the persecution of the Baha'is, for example, of which there are not many, but there are dozens in Yemen. And the Houthis' attention on the Baha'is is probably something born out of Iranian influence, because it's not a group the Houthis cared about before Iran got involved. But outside of that, Iran doesn't seem to really matter much when it comes to domestic policy. When it comes to foreign policy, which the Houthis really haven't needed to have, Iran becomes much more important. In some respects, Iran was important and foundational to the Houthis' own main ideological foundation, right? I mean, the Houthi slogan, which is well known, which is "Death to Israel, death to America, curse upon the Jews, and victory for Islam." I don't know if I got each part right in order, but that's the gist. Was inspired by Khomeini. It was inspired by the Islamic Revolution. It was the idea that the Houthis had that, the legacy that they were trying to sort of reignite, which is sort of the power of the Sayyid class within Yemen, didn't resonate with Yemeni society anymore. But politics did, and Israel did, and the United States did. And so using sort of popular politics was a way of igniting interest among young people and sort of greasing the skids for relationships with other sort of like-minded groups. And so what you see now is with the Houthis sort of attacking Israel and attacking shipping, with the attempt to blockade shipping headed towards Israel, is well in line with what the Houthis say they would have wanted to do from the outset. So on the one hand, it absolutely serves a core Houthi interest, a domestic, if you will, interest of helping to prove their bona fides when it comes to their stance on Israel, but also to prove to their population or to their fighters that they're serious about this stuff, as they are trying to sort of increase their rule over Yemen. This gives them a pretext, showing that they, not only walk the walk or talk the talk, but walk the walk. So it works for them domestically, but that it happened at all is no coincidence. And Iran is clearly behind enabling the Houthis to have these capabilities by providing its missiles, by providing its rockets, by providing the intelligence, the communications and logistics technology, by sending advisors, by giving it coordinates to strike. All of it is facilitated by the IRGC because the Houthis serve as a proxy in this conflict for the IRGC against Israel and against the United States. So that's a long-winded way of saying the Houthis are both their own free agent, if you will, but they are also a proxy of Iran when it comes to certain activities in the foreign policy sphere. And what we're seeing right now regarding Gaza, the blockade, et cetera, is a clear example of the Houthis acting as a proxy.
So these attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthis fit into their domestic agenda, but also directed to some degree or enabled by Iran. So does the same apply to the October 7th attacks by Hamas? Because, we've seen conflicting reports about whether Iran had foreknowledge about them, whether the attacks were in their interests, whether they were caught off guard. What can we say with confidence was the Iranian role in the October 7th attacks by Hamas?
Well, what you can say with confidence is that Iran enabled those attacks by providing the weapons and the know-how to Hamas fighters to at least do some aspects of the October 7th attacks, right? So, for example, the missile barrage and rocket barrage that Hamas used at the outset of October 7th to distract the Israelis from their actual intentions were using weapons that were provided by Iran, both the know-how to produce those weapons and the ability to use them tactically and strategically. So Iran was certainly empowering Hamas to take its war to Israel, something that Hamas wanted to do anyway. So in that sense, October 7th was perfectly in keeping with what the IRGC had hoped Hamas would be able to do. One thing we haven't talked about is that Iran and Israel have been in a state of open conflict for a long time. That conflict plays out generally in the shadows, we like to say, as a euphemism, but it's been ongoing for a long time. And so October 7th, even if the IRGC wasn't informed, I suspect they were, but they may not have been, is something that they would have wanted to achieve. And it's certainly something that as soon as it happened, within minutes, the IRGC celebrated as if it was its own victory. They were smart enough to say, well, we had nothing to do with this. But on the other hand, they celebrated it as if they had everything to do with it. So whether they were just sort of indirectly responsible or directly responsible or somewhere in between of the October 7th attacks, they were certainly involved to a degree. But we don't know much more than that because, as you say, the reporting is conflicting. We have anonymous sources that say absolutely Iran was involved, coming from Iran, from Hamas, from Hezbollah, and we have sources coming from all of those saying no, they weren't involved. So it's difficult to say exactly who's right. One thing that we can say is that Israel didn't seem to have strong enough evidence that it believed its intelligence that October 7th was going to happen. And you would like to think that if Israel knew that something like this was going to happen or knew that Iran was somehow involved in it, that they would be more declarative about Iran's responsibility. But I think even if they were declarative about Iran's responsibility, it makes what the Israelis felt like they needed to do after October 7th much more difficult. Because having Hamas as the perpetrator is one thing. Having Iran as the perpetrator is another. Going to war in Gaza is one thing. Going to war against Iran is another. And even if the Israelis haven't indicated that Iran is culpable, I have a feeling that within their military and intelligence services, that there is some desire that after the war in Gaza is over, assuming it will be over at some point, that they will turn their attentions to Iran. That doesn't mean going to war with Iran, but it just means finding a way to retaliate against Iran in ways they haven't yet.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, I want to flesh that out a bit more in terms of what options Israel has in terms of retaliating against Iran, and what other cards can Iran play as well, because we have a pretty fluid state of play here. Iran doesn't want a direct fight with Israel. Israel doesn't want a direct fight with Iran. Hezbollah can't afford a direct war at this point because Lebanon is essentially a failed state. The Houthis are this kind of wild card that have emerged and are pretty important because they're impacting global trade. So what other cards does Iran have to play? Are Iraq's PMFs a factor here? Could it leverage other elements in this so-called axis of resistance? Can these guys hit Israel by drone or missile?
Well, in the past, Iran's main pressure points against Israel, besides Hamas and Hezbollah, have been going against Israel's allies or going against the U.S.'s allies, which basically means putting pressure on U.S. forces in the region, primarily Iraq, which is happening right now, or by putting pressure on the Saudis or Emiratis. That's happened in the past. Right now, Iran has a detente and is seeking to repair relations with both the Saudis and the Emiratis. So it's not easy to put pressure on them, and it's not easy to put pressure, let's say, on Bahrain, because any pressure put on Bahrain is going to upset the Emiratis and the Saudis, and all of that will be different. So Iran's main pressure point that it's had has been the Houthis, firing missiles at ships, and then Shia militias in Iraq firing rockets at U.S. forces in both Iraq and Syria. That's been, Iran's main card that it can play. It can fire weapons at Israel, either from Iraq or from Lebanon or from Yemen or even from Iran. But doing so always risks sort of triggering direct retaliation by Israel. So in some sense, Iran is playing to include all of its clients and proxies. Iran is playing most of the cards that it already has, in the sense that all of these groups are involved in putting pressure on either Israel or the United States in the region right now. All of them. There's not a single militia that's not firing rockets or mortars or doing something at the moment. So Iran's, archipelago of clients is fully involved in trying to sort of pressure both Israel and the United States on this war. But let's just say that something changes. Like right now, the Secretary of Defense announced today that the United States military and the Iraqi government are going to have discussions and dialogues about the future of U.S. The future of the U.S. military presence and coalition activities regarding ISIS in Iraq. Should the U.S., let's say, leave Iraq and leave Syria and cede the war against ISIS to the Iraqis and to other groups, then Iran won't easily have that card to play against the United States, can't easily sort of target the U.S. forces in the region without, doing something much more dramatic, like launching missiles into Qatar or something that they're not likely to do. So that would, on the one hand, be welcomed by Iran, but they would also sort of lose a point of leverage. Basically, the only real card that Iran has left is to launch missiles directly at either Israel or at U.S. forces in the region. It could, obviously Hezbollah could start a war with Israel, but as we've said, Israel doesn't want that. Hezbollah doesn't want that. Lebanon certainly doesn't want that. So it's not an easy thing to ask Hezbollah to do, and I don't think that it would necessarily benefit Iran to do it, because Hezbollah is unlikely to win that conflict. And Lebanon is much more likely to look like Gaza than Israel after such a conflict. So that wouldn't really benefit Iran. None of Iran's clients can take the fight to Israel. They can really only launch things into Israel. And, they're already doing that. So Iran has kind of exhausted its effort, which is why it's trying to get creative by messaging, its willingness to go direct by launching missiles, like it did a couple of weeks ago, into Iraq or into Pakistan or into Syria, and killing some maybe innocent civilians and children in the process, as a way to showcase, hey, listen, we can go direct, we can do these things ourselves. If you keep it up, that's to say pressure on Iran, we can hit back. But if Iran does that, that invites a war, either with Israel or the United States. So it makes it very complicated. We're kind of in this very weird dance where nobody totally wants to fight, but Iran and its proxies really want to make noise and really want to show that they're willing to fight, even if they don't actually want a war. So it makes it really awkward. But what they are trying to do is, at the very least, disincentivize the United States from enduring its mission in Iraq and Syria. If they're able to achieve that, then they will have taken everything that has happened over the last several weeks or months since October, whenever the October 16th or whenever these strikes started happening in Iraq. They'll take that as a worthy trade that they were able to sort of push out the United States yet again. But barring that, they're really limited in what they can do, which is what makes it so dangerous and what makes it so sort of unknown in terms of where it goes from here.
And you talked about how many sides in this conflict, the U.S. and Iran and Israel, want to avoid a direct clash, and we've seen some really interesting reports in the past few days where Iran has reportedly sent back-channel messages to the U.S. That it, trying to articulate that it doesn't want a wider regional war. And then the Wall Street Journal reports that the U.S. secretly alerted Iran ahead of the recent ISIS attack in Kerman about the possibility of this attack and provided it with some solid intelligence on this. So alongside this risk-taking by many actors involved in this broad conflict, there are also this attempt to kind of calibrate, the reactions of others and manage the course of this crisis. Now, when we look at the big picture, Iran's proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen have prevailed. Hezbollah is arguably the most powerful group in Lebanon today. Iran has strategic depth deep into the Arab Middle East. The U.S. is largely removed from, significant parts of the region. It's sort of relegated to outposts in Syria and Iraq, and then its traditional bases in the Gulf Arab states. The Saudis have backed down. One might say they've buckled. So it seems to me that Iran or the Iranian regime may be the biggest winner of these post 9/11 wars. Would you agree?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think in a zero sum perspective of the post 2003 Middle East, Iran has gained far more than any other actor, and U.S. influence has slipped more than it had before then. Right. So the U.S. has declined in terms of influence in the Middle East, and Iran has increased its influence. If you step back a little bit more, I think the United States is still far more influential in the Middle East than Iran is. Iran's influence is run almost entirely through coercion. It has nothing else to provide. It certainly has no other incentives other than we will not attack you if you leave us alone or if you get out of the way. It has no money to give. It has, in any real capacity to states, that is. It has no investment to provide. It, of course, has hydrocarbons, but lots of people have hydrocarbons in the Middle East. So that's not sort of unique or interesting. It doesn't have a political system that is attractive to other states to adopt. It doesn't have a geopolitical sort of orientation that is necessarily attractive to other states. So, yes, through coercion, through subterfuge, through really dogged exploitation of conflicts and crises, Iran has capitalized much more on what has occurred in the Middle East than any other actor. It has outcompeted its rivals, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. It is by far the strongest state in the Persian Gulf. It has alliances with countries that are much deeper than some of its neighbors, but those countries are failed or failing states. So even though the alliances are strong, the actual bloc is weak. So in some respects, Iran has absolutely been the victor in the regional conflicts that have followed the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. But beyond that, I think what Iran is able to do with that victory is still very much in question. While the IRGC, I think, believes that they can somehow translate these victories into the beginnings of a new global political orientation, right? One in which the United States and Western Europe are on the decline and less influential, and one in which, they would say resistance powers, but, another way of saying it is authoritarian states, and like them or like China and Russia would somehow, prove to be the new center of gravity in the globe. They have that ambition, they have that desire, they have that intention, but they can hardly get out of their own way because they simply have not been able to translate, even with Iran, the Islamic Revolution into anything more than a coercive apparatus. That is the only way that they hold the Islamic Revolution together, is through coercion, through oppression, through state violence. Religion is far less popular in Iran now than it was in the 70s. Israel is less popular, or is much more popular in Iran than it is in any other Muslim majority state. Iranians tend to have far less affinity with other Islamic states, despite the Islamic Republic's emphasis on sort of the Islamicness of their government. So they haven't even been able to achieve that in Iran. And they show no signs of being able to do that, to do that in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or anywhere else. So I think their victory is pretty hollow, but that doesn't mean it's not significant. And that doesn't mean that the next decade, at the very least, will not be, heavily shaped by the product of Iran's growing influence. And I think one thing that is difficult for people to appreciate is that right now we are hoping that the Gaza war will end and that will somehow sort of cease what the Houthis are doing or what the Shia militias are doing in Iraq and somehow calm down the Middle East. But for Iran, the Gaza war is just an episode. This is one step towards an eventual victory. And, Iran is going to keep pushing and its proxies are going to keep pushing until they maximize their victory. And their victory will not end until Israel is no longer, until the United States, no longer has any influence in the regime or in the region, and until other regional states aren't working in lockstep with Iran, or at least, standing out of the way. So while Iran has been victorious, I think, it sets up, I think, a new chapter for the Middle East, which unfortunately I think is going to be just as dark as the last 2 decades have been.
Right, and that new chapter is marked by, Iran having unprecedented regional influence. Its strategic depth is quite deep, but at the same time, state-society relations have deeply eroded, and so its regional influence is at its peak, but its legitimacy within is perhaps at its lowest point since 1979. Now, final question: when we look at the coming weeks and months ahead, I won't ask you to make any predictions. That's a bit too much because there's so much going on. But as observers of the region, what should we be looking out for?
Well, I think for me, what I'm looking at is once the Gaza war is settled in a way, right? Once combat has sort of concluded, there's going to be what happens next? And Gaza is going to be one of those issues. The Palestinian question is going to be one of those issues. And that's going to take a lot of the energies of regional states. But one thing that's going to endure beyond that is Israel's conflict with Iran, or Iran's conflict with Israel. That's not going to be settled with whatever happens in Gaza. It's not going to be settled with whatever happens in the West Bank. It's not going to be settled if Saudi Arabia normalizes with Israel and if there's, a pathway, quote unquote, to a Palestinian state. It's going to endure. And to me, that is sort of the next step in where this is going. I mean, I find it somewhat ironic that that's the US and Iran and everybody else, always says we don't want a regional war. We have a region. We've had a regional war. That regional war is ongoing. This is just one, I would say, sort of particularly intense moment of that regional conflict. But that regional conflict has been going on since 2003 in various ways. And, we're going to enter a new stage where that conflict evolves yet again. And I think what is going to be challenging is not just sort of the Iran-Israel sort of binary axis within that conflict, but Iran has also made strides to intertwine its conflicts in the region, its intentions and desires in the region, its ambitions, with those of China and Russia. And to some extent has been successful, to some extent has not been successful. But one way that it has been successful, inadvertently, is that most of America's major partners and allies within the region, particularly Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have, for their own reasons and for their own purposes, decreased their relationship with the United States in an effort to increase their relationship with China in particular, but also with Russia. by inviting China and Russia to play a bigger role in the region, by pursuing both strategic and economic agreements with China, and looking for ways to sort of integrate both China and Russia more within their foreign policy architecture. And Iran is very much on board with that. Iran has been attempting to do the same thing. So far, Iran's relationships with Russia and China and the Arab states' relationships with Russia and China are pretty separate. But the Palestinian issue is something that, at least right now, is coalescing Iran and the Arab states in a way that nothing else really can. And so it'll be interesting going forward to see how Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iran, even Turkey, how they use sort of the post-Gaza sort of geopolitical climate to their benefit, but also how they use it in terms of both the relationships with the United States and the relationships with other foreign powers. Because it seems to me that things are gradually gravitating east when it comes to sort of the center of influence within the Middle East. And I think for the United States, it's going to be a very difficult task to recapture the status that it once has, even though it will still have a very important role in the region. I think more space has been ceded to China and Russia. And this particular episode or moment within the Middle East may push it, just a bit more. So it'll be interesting to see how much more intertwined Middle East politics becomes with larger geopolitics. And that's what I'm going to be looking at, I think, and is something that'll be interesting to see. One thing that I think we tend not to sort of appreciate when we talk about, let's say, great power competition, is that just like during the Cold War, it's likely not going to play out in neat sort of binary ways. It's likely going to increasingly be global. And I think because of both where the Middle East, sits geographically, but also because of the various and collective sort of ambitions of regional actors, to include Iran, the Middle East is going to be much more intertwined in great power competition than I think a lot of people appreciate.
And that was Afshon Ostovar of the Naval Postgraduate School. Please subscribe to our show on your platform of choice, and thank you for tuning in.